That's the theme this morning, if you hadn't picked that up yet. It's back there in the letters. And of course, as I explained, welcome is a great word. It comes from the Middle English, came into Middle English from the Old Norse. That is, it's a Scandinavian word. And there are some similar words in modern Scandinavian, German, and Dutch. And a welcome is a salutation or a greeting, but it is also an invitation to enter. If we welcome someone, we are inviting them into our homes, we are inviting them into our meeting, or we are inviting them into our lives. To welcome is to give someone a place in your life. It is a granting of access. And so welcome is a hospitality word. And while Jesus did not speak English, and he did not speak German or Dutch or even Swedish, which would come as a shock to some of the immigrants who started the covenant churches. In the United States, they kind of thought that Jesus spoke Swedish. It was a mistake because he really spoke Norwegian, but that's another issue. But the concept, even though Jesus did not speak any of these languages, the concept was definitely there in his message. So we pick up our story again. This time we're in Mark 9. And finally the disciples are starting to get into this whole kingdom of God thing that Jesus has been talking about. After all the healings, after the mass feeding of all of these people with the leftovers and the extra bread and the extra fish, and after all these hours of teaching, they're starting to visualize it. They're starting to imagine how they would be a part of Jesus' kingdom. And that's when the argument broke out. It was a bit like a prototype of the presidential debate. Just as absurd. Each candidate, pretending to be an expert, parades their personal incompetencies while thinking that they are leaving a positive impression upon everybody. So Peter, James, and John each thought that they would be the best candidates for Secretary of State. Matthew and Judas Iscariot were arguing over who had the most experience in collecting and managing money, and therefore who should become the Secretary of the Treasury. Simon the Zealot was arguing that he should be put in charge of national security and the defense forces because he'd come up with this great idea about building a wall around Judea to keep out both the Roman army and the Gentiles. And he knew that it would work because it was his idea. Thomas, on the other hand, was not so sure, and he pointed out that the whole wall thing had failed to protect Jerusalem against the Babylonians and the Romans. And it just went back and forth, and the debate was getting pretty heated and audacious. And they finally got to their destination in Capernaum. They got into the house where this merry band of brothers were staying, and once inside, Jesus turns to them and says, "Well, what were you guys arguing about out on the road, on the journey?" And it's not like he didn't know. These guys were so transparent that they were almost ghosts. I mean, there was not a lot of substance to hide their egos. Verse 34, Mark 9:34. They didn't respond, since on the way they had been debating with each other about who was the greatest. Jesus knew that, so he called a timeout. He said, "We need to have a family meeting." Verse 35. He sat down, that is, he assumed the teaching position. He sat down and he called the 12, and he said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last, must be the least of all, and the servant of all. That of course, was the very kind of thing Jesus had been saying the whole entire time anyway. It was not new information, but they didn't really still get it, even though they thought that they got it. And of course, you've got these 12 guys who are the apprentices, who are moving their heads up and down with every word that Jesus, yes, yes. We're in total agreement with you. We understand everything you're saying, in spite of the fact that they were not at all connecting the dots. So, can you kind of see where this is going? Verse 36. Jesus reached for a little child, placed him among the 12 in the family meeting, out in the center of it all, and embraced him. Then he said, verse 37, "Whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me isn't actually welcoming me, but rather the one who sent me." And this morning I want us to spend our time with verse 37 here, because it is pivotal and it really encapsulates the message that Jesus is sending to his cocky disciples and to everybody else as well. And the important word in all of this discussion is welcomes. Welcomes. The disciples are each trying to figure out how to work Jesus' kingdom to their advantage. But Jesus says, you've got it completely backward. To participate in Jesus' kingdom, we have to be welcoming. That's the first of the 4 observations that I want to pull from our passage this morning. To participate in Jesus' kingdom, we have to be welcoming. To welcome is a completely different mindset. Politics, as usual, whether they are in public or personal arenas, is about gaining and maintaining power. It is about working the relationships to advance self. Welcoming is about serving, about putting yourself in a position where your primary concern is enhancing the life of someone else. And the paradox, of course, is that in Jesus' kingdom, you actually gain position, you gain poll points by laying down your life alongside Jesus. Thus, verse 35, where he says, "Whoever wants to be first must be least of all and the servant of all." So, Jesus makes this point by welcoming a little child into their midst, the midst of this family meeting. And verse 36 says that Jesus embraced him. Now, in our culture, we've got a fairly romanticized or idealized view of children. It's not that in the ancient world they did not love children. They loved their children back in the ancient times. They did, but a large percentage of children never survived to adulthood. I read one study this past week which suggested that 30% of the children born in the first century died before reaching maturity. 30%. So the attachments to children were a little bit different. They were more reserved. And childhood was not so much an idealized time of life, but it was considered to be the most vulnerable time of life. The idea that you would build an amusement park for children, or that you would have children's parties, they are all very foreign concepts. You do not want to celebrate until you get them to maturity. The young were prone to diseases. The children were the weakest of all people. They were the most powerless, and they were the most vulnerable. So, Jesus is using the child as the poster child for the powerless and the vulnerable of all times. To participate in Jesus' kingdom, we have to be welcoming of the powerless and vulnerable. That's the second of the observations. To participate in Jesus' kingdom, we have to be welcoming of the powerless and vulnerable. Who do you think are the most powerless and vulnerable people today? Who do you think? Children? Who else?
Victims of sex trafficking.
Victims of sex trafficking. All these very vulnerable people.
Elderly.
Elderly can be very vulnerable. Yeah. Elderly who are mentally ill are very vulnerable. Immigrants. Yeah, you think about all those guys out in the desert, and not only are they prone to or subject to the conditions out there, but there are bandits and robbers and
the coyotes themselves.
Yeah.
Human coyotes.
Human coyotes are taking advantage of them. Yeah, I mean, it's just, you mentioned children. I would, and then we say refugees. You know, that's been big in the news this past week. The refugees coming out of Syria and the war devastation there. And it's kind of overwhelming in Europe, and they don't know what to do with all these guys. You know, and then there was that one image in the news of a child that had washed up on shore, I think in Italy, and that just kind of changed the tide of the discussion as people saw the vulnerability of the children that were caught in the midst of all of this. I'd say the broken children, those who have already suffered abuse or who have suffered trauma of some sort, whether it's from war or from adults or circumstances. And one of the reasons that I so much enjoy working with you guys is that so many of you already have a heart for welcoming broken children into your lives. I mean, you are the foster parents. You are those who adopt kids who have special needs. You are those who care for kids who live apart from their families. You are those who sponsor Covenant Kids Congo children. You are those who help establish family farms in Congo. You've done help establish, bring about supplies for kids in war-torn South Sudan. And whether you realize it or not, your actions are lining up with Jesus' instruction to his disciples. So at the very least, that suggests a strong predisposition toward Jesus and his kingdom. It's been a part of our tradition, our long-established tradition as a church, to take on a special project each Christmas, a project which centers on helping vulnerable children. And this Christmas, I'm going to suggest that we take on a project that is related to water. And we'll be talking more about that in the next couple of months. But I want to whet your appetites now, so to speak. And I've got a brief little video introduction to the concept. I had a brief introduction to it. As I said, more about that later. But the point is that when we welcome the broken, when we welcome the vulnerable, especially the children, into our lives, we are welcoming Jesus. And that brings us to the third observation from our passage. To participate in Jesus' kingdom, we have to be welcoming of the powerless and vulnerable. And by doing that, we actually welcome Jesus himself. And by doing that, we actually welcome Jesus himself. Whoever welcomes one of these children in my name welcomes me. And that's really what it's about anyway. The point is not to jockey for positions or status, but to have Jesus living in our lives. Now in America, we've narrowed the idea of receiving or welcoming Jesus down to making a decision for him. Accepting Jesus into our lives. Accept Jesus into your heart. Which becomes kind of a momentary event to which we would point. And that's not bad. That's actually good. That's actually helpful. But it does not go as far as Jesus himself went with this thing. To receive Jesus is still the point of it all, but we do that by embracing those whom Jesus embraces, according to what Jesus said. In my mind, it's like a group hug. In verse 36, it says that Jesus embraced the child. Then he invited the disciples to embrace the children. So he's saying, in essence, join me in hugging these vulnerable, unimportant people. Picture it in your mind. The only way to embrace Jesus is also to embrace those whom Jesus is embracing. It's a package deal. Embracing the weak and the vulnerable in Jesus' name is a part of what it means to embrace or to welcome him. Observation number 4. To participate in Jesus' kingdom, we have to be welcoming of the powerless and vulnerable, and by doing so, we actually welcome Jesus himself and his Father who sent him. And his Father who sent him. Jesus says, and whoever welcomes me isn't actually welcoming me, but rather the one who sent me. When we welcome Jesus into our lives by sharing in his mission, by joining in the embrace, by joining in the group hug, we are welcoming the fullness of God. Jesus and his mission of welcome is how we know God. It's how we connect with God. It's how we welcome him to what is already his, actually. Elsewhere in John 14, 6 through 7, Jesus elaborates on how our critical connection with God is related to him. And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And then he says, if you have really known me, you will also know the Father. From now on, you know him and have seen him. Seeing me is seeing him. When you welcome Jesus and the vulnerable people that he is embracing, you are welcoming the Father who sent him. So to know him is to know the Father. That there is no other way to know God than to know Jesus. And practically speaking, that means that we put out the welcome mat, especially for those who are broken, weak, and vulnerable. And when you think about it, we are all in some sense broken people. We are all weak people. We are all vulnerable people. Those vulnerable people out there, they are us. They are like us in more ways than we are willing to admit. And the only reason that we all together have access to God, access to meaning and access to hope in life, is that Jesus has embraced us with a hug that is way more than kind of a perfunctory kind of hug. As Jesus says in verse 31, the human one will be delivered into human hands. They will kill him. 3 days after he is killed, he will rise up. That's how he welcomes us. So we too need to welcome him and all the beneficiaries in the embrace of his mercy. And that is the good news. So, who would like to add a thought or connect some of the dots even more so, or ask a question, maybe share a word of testimony? What do you think?
I just wonder about the apostles and their lack of understanding for all these happenings that took place that were so amazing. And yet I wonder how quickly we would accept him, if he appeared. Or would we think he was some kind of a magician?
Yeah, if they were slow to get it, how much slower would I be to get it? But some of it is that their cultural predisposition, so to speak, of what this Messiah, this Son of God should look like, was so strong that Jesus was having to undo, he was having to help them unlearn some bad theology in order to get to his point. And I wonder how much stuff we have to unlearn in order to get to the point that Jesus is making about who's embracing who's and how we embrace it.
Verse 35 really sets a foundation for all that he's saying here, and that's a total replacement of self.
Yes, it's he said down, whoever wants to be first must be least of all and servant of all.
See, that's very difficult for us, and it's always been difficult.
Yeah.
For cultures, that our culture today is really difficult to say to ourselves, I am poor in spirit. Without Christ, I am nothing. And until we can grasp that and totally limit selfishness within our lives, this doesn't come about.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the human condition. And in some cultures, it's the kind of selflessness is given a tip of the hat, like in Japanese culture. If you've ever had anything translated if you're speaking and have stuff translated in Japanese, when they say it in Japanese, it takes 10 times longer than when they're saying it in English because of all of the humble language that's inserted into it. Your humble servant, your selfless, it goes on in terms of how the culture works. But even in a selfless, if there's that thin veneer of selflessness in the culture, that does not mean that it necessarily translates into the people. But if the culture itself says, assert yourself, go for it. You're the most important person alive.
I'm number one.
I'm number one, kind of thing.
Yeah,
You're
number
even
one.
further down the line than in a culture where there's this kind of humbleness built into the culture itself.
And what Jesus is talking about here is a transformation within, which then makes the transformation without what he's talking about.
Yeah, I would argue that the transformation within only happens as the transformation without. They go hand in hand.
Sure.
You can't have one without the other. You have to embrace the child as you're embracing me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's how you're changed inside. Other thoughts?
He sometimes has such subtle ways to discuss things with his disciples when he taught them. And even then, many times they couldn't grasp it. It's kind of like we're all sitting around visiting, laying out certain things, and when it's all said and done, I say to Michael, what was that? But we would not have been any different.
No, I'm not any more enlightened. If anything, I would be a tougher sell.
In the world, a lot of people believe if I have much knowledge, I have a higher education, I will be the greatest in the world. I will be the greatest.
You'll be the greatest if you have more education.
And higher education. If I have much money and enrichment,
Yeah.
I have power and the greatest. And then the actually is true in the world. The people who has higher education, they get a good position, they work less.
In that system.
Yes. And the people who has money, they have the power to influence everybody.
Yeah.
They don't need to do everything. So,
But Jesus says we're going to stand this on its head.
yes, but it's the reason it's hard for the people to understand this one because the influence by the world.
Yeah. And I think the antidote, the medicine that fixes the disease, is to keep focusing on Jesus and to talk about Jesus. You know, when I'm talking with people during the week, whether it's in face-to-face or on the internet in some kind of discussion, I don't mind, saying, that's interesting. Jesus said something similar, or Jesus would have felt uncomfortable with this. You just keep bringing Jesus up. Just keep talking about Jesus.
Yes. And also, as Jesus said, we want to be the greatest, we have to serve others and to do more, right? So in my understanding, it's like the more we do, the more power we gain. Suppose like this way.
The more power, when Jesus says,
the more you do, the more you serve.
The more you serve, the greater you are, the more power you get.
Yeah,
He's talking about in His kingdom, His system. He's not saying in the world system, the more you serve, the more power you're going to get. He's talking about it in His system. And He says it's His system is the one that's going to end up being on top in the end anyway. So that's the one you want to invest in. You don't want to invest in the world system because it's going down the toilet. You want to invest in the system that's on the rise.
But the problem is, yes, two systems, different systems, and in God's kingdom is in this field and in this way, but in the world in the other way, right? But we have to find out something to connect it together. And in this way, I think God is doing something to let the people to understand His system, His way, and that is shown from us. So suppose we still have to do more and get more power.
But you get more power in a different. You don't want to get world power. The world power, by acquiring worldly power, is not going to advance the kingdom of God.
But before-
By having more money, you are not going to advance the kingdom of
I
God.
see how the people see the ways of God, the way of God. If life is-
When a humble person lives it in the factory,
Mhm.
that is a powerful action in and of itself. And you could not buy that kind of witness if you had millions of dollars.
But the people think you're crazy. The more you do, the more you let them they think you're crazy.
Yeah, let them think you're crazy.
So this is the hard problem.
Give it time. Give it time. Yeah. Someone want to add something? It's all right. We are crazy.
Yes, this is the wrong way.
From that view, Paul says it's foolishness.
Yes,
He often says that. He says, I'm just a fool. I'm just a crazy guy.
yes.
It's all right.